Good morning, brothers and sisters, or good afternoon, or good evening, whenever it is that you happen to be tuning into the class. I appreciate your continued interest in this study, and I appreciate the opportunity that we're having each week to focus our hearts and minds and spirits on the life and ministry and teaching, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ as recorded in the Gospel of Mark. This is our class for Sunday, February the 21st, and I'm grateful that the deep freeze that we experienced last week has finally thawed out, at least in our area of the country. And I know that tens of millions of others in the nation are continuing to suffer under freezing conditions and severe winter storms. So our thoughts and prayers are with them today. And I'm grateful that conditions have improved enough here that there wasn't any concern, any question about our ability to meet in person today at 10 o'clock for our worship assembly. So whether you're here today in person at 10 or worshiping with us through the live stream, we look forward to that time of praising God together as well. We're going to pick up in our study this morning in Mark chapter 8. And once again, we find Jesus surrounded by a large crowd of people. And as we read through these verses that follow, we'll get the sense that these large gatherings that went on for days seem to have just happened spontaneously. It wasn't like this was something that was advertised ahead of time. I think back to the frontier revivals that took place during the Second Great Awakening, second great religious awakening in the history of our country. But people had time to prepare for that, and they would go to those events prepared for them, ready to stay for a week or 2 weeks, and they would take food, they would take other provisions. These seem to have happened spontaneously around Jesus. A crowd would begin to gather, they would begin to follow him, they would listen to him teach, the day would wear long, they would spend the night. They would listen to him teach all the next day, and maybe they had come for healing as well. And then one night turned into two, turned into three, and suddenly there was a great level of need among all of the people. And that's exactly what we find here in the beginning of Mark chapter 8. So reading from verse 1, during those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. It's no surprise to us that Jesus says, I have compassion for the people. He always has compassion for the people. He is the good shepherd. He is the one who has been sent to shepherd the flock of God and to make one fold, one flock out of all the nations of the world. And the miracle that follows, the feeding of the 4,000, is so reminiscent of the feeding of the 5,000 2 chapters earlier. But there, back in Mark chapter 6, verse 34, we see a similar statement made about Jesus, not in his own words, as we find in Mark chapter 8, but in Mark's description of the situation. In Mark chapter 6, verse 34, when Jesus had landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And once again, we have an almost identical situation. And some may wonder, is this just a variant account of the same event? Are the details just different because of a different tradition that was handed down orally, and Mark thinks that they are different events, and so he records them separately? I don't think that's the case at all. Why should it be surprising to us that Jesus would feed masses of people with a meager amount of food on just one occasion? Think about the other miracles of Jesus. How many blind people did Jesus heal? I think one person counted up 7 distinct accounts in the Gospels of blind people being healed by Jesus, and that's just among his recorded miracles. How many demon-possessed people did Jesus free from the evil spirits that inhabited their minds, inhabited their bodies and tormented their minds. How many lepers did Jesus heal? How many people who were paralyzed were given the ability to walk by Jesus? Did Jesus just raise one person from the dead? Was it just Lazarus? No, there was Lazarus. There was Jairus' daughter. There was the son of the widow in the village of Nain. And so Jesus performed these signs and miracles and wonders over and over and over again. And it's quite possible that there were additional occasions when Jesus fed large numbers of people with with a small amount of food, even though it's not recorded in the Gospels. As John says at the end of his Gospel account, there were so many other things that Jesus said and did that are not recorded here. It's just not possible for that to be done. So once again, Jesus sees hungry people and feels that the hunger of other people is his business. The hunger of other people is his concern. It's a problem to be solved that he and his disciples need to provide for. And so he throws it on his disciples once again. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? Jesus simply asked them, what's on hand? What do you have? Is it nothing? Is it something? Well, it turns out it was something, but only 7 loaves of bread. In the feeding of the 5,000, that's recorded in all 5 Gospels, this miracle, the feeding of the 4,000, is only recorded in Mark and Matthew. So I may be making references back to Matthew, both here and in the texts that follow, that are paralleled in Matthew chapter 15 and Matthew chapter 16. But there, you remember, there were 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Here, there are 7 loaves. It takes a little while for the fish to be mentioned in Mark's account of this. So how many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. This is reminiscent of what he did in Mark chapter 6. This is reminiscent of what he's going to do in the upper room in Mark chapter 14, where he takes the bread, he gives thanks, and he begins to distribute it. Verse 7 is where we learn about the fish. They also had a few small fish. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. They ate to the full. It wasn't a little snack. It was an all-you-could-eat buffet. And so they ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over. With the feeding of the 5,000, 12 baskets full of pieces of fish and bread. About 4,000, verse 9 says, about 4,000 were present. Mark doesn't specify here, and as I don't think he specifies back in chapter 6. And it's not just an assumption that we make that there were also women and children present. Only Matthew, in the recording of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 that's recorded in all 4 Gospels, only Matthew says that there were 5,000 men besides women and children. So we can add that detail to the story as well. Matthew also does that with the feeding of the 4,000. There were 4,000 men besides women and children. So the crowd could have been many, many thousands more than that were fed on this occasion. So they gather up the baskets full of leftovers, and it says that he sent the people away. Now, they're not going to faint on the way home. They've been well fed, plenty of nutrition for the journey home. So he sends them away and got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. Where is Dalmanutha? I don't know. And most biblical scholars say they don't know. Matthew's account at the end of the feeding of the 4,000 says that they sailed to the region of Magadan. Again, whether Magadan was a place close to Dalmanutha Most scholars say we really don't know. And this is unusual in the Gospels. Typically, they are well-recognized place names, even though they're likely known by different names today. It's just that this one is somewhat of a poser to biblical scholars, and they don't know, was this a place on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, the western shore of the Sea of Galilee? Wherever it was a populated place because there were Pharisees that were there, Pharisees who knew about Jesus and Pharisees who wanted to try to trick him, Pharisees who wanted to try to test him. Verse 11, in this region of Dalmanutha or Magadan, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven, to try him, to seek to push him, to antagonize him, to push his buttons. They asked for a sign. How many signs had Jesus performed? How many miracles had he done? Yet they weren't willing to believe his divine power. They attributed his ability to cast out demons to the ruler of the demons. They're not looking for faith. They're not looking to be thoroughly convinced that they were just almost there and all they needed was just one more sign. That's not it at all. Jesus sighed deeply. Jesus sighed deeply, verse 12 says. And it's a sigh of frustration. In the previous chapter, with the healing of the man who was deaf and was unable to speak, except with great difficulty, Jesus sighed there as well. That's verse 34 of Mark chapter 7. Jesus looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, be opened. That was a sigh of compassion and sympathy and empathy, a sigh of plea to the Father. Grant that this be done, be opened. Here it's a sigh of frustration. And Jesus says, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. Matthew gives us a little more detail about this circumstance, and I just want to read the first 4 verses from Matthew chapter 16 with you as Jesus, as Matthew records a longer response from Jesus on that occasion. Matthew chapter 16, verse 1, the Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He replied, when evening comes, you say, it will be fair weather tomorrow, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, and none will be given it, just like he says in Mark chapter 8, none will be given except the sign of Jonah. Jesus then left and went away. On another occasion, Jesus will explain further, no sign will be given except the sign of Jonah. And like he was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days, the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days. But Jesus says, I'm not here for parlor tricks. I'm not a magician. I'm not a performer. And you are not my audience. And so no sign is going to be given to you. It would be a wasted sign. It truly would be casting pearls before swine and giving holy what is holy to dogs, those who have no appreciation for the true things of God. So he and his disciples get back in the boat, go back over to the other side. And Mark lets us know that on the, I don't know how long they were in the region of Dalmanutha, but whether they knew exactly when Jesus was going to say, okay, let's go back over to the other side. Maybe they just didn't know. Maybe that's why they didn't make preparations. Maybe that's why they didn't have any bread. So verse 14 says the disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. And maybe they're conscious of that. Maybe they're hoping no one will say anything about food or being hungry or wanting to eat. And so that's probably already working in their minds when Jesus warns them. Jesus says, be careful. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. In Matthew's account, in Matthew chapter 16, beware of the yeast, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And when he says yeast, when he says bread, all they can think of is physical yeast and physical bread. If you follow Matthew's chronology, he's already shared with them the parable of the yeast, the parable of the leaven. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman put in 60 pounds of flour until it worked its way through all of the flour, until it leavened all of the dough. He was making a comparison there, a likeness between that and the kingdom of heaven. So he's already used leaven in a figurative way. They don't even think about that. They just think Jesus is being passive aggressive, that he's not just outright chastising them for not bringing any bread. He's just going about it in a roundabout way in their minds. So they're discussing this with one another and saying, did he say that because we have no bread? Whose job was it today? Whose turn was it to make sure we had bread? That's what they're thinking about and talking about. And Jesus is just sort of eavesdropping on the discussion until he finally says, probably with another sigh, not a sigh of compassion and empathy, not a sigh of frustration, although there may have been some frustration with his disciples. It's more of a sigh of disappointment. Really, after all this time, all the signs, all the miracles, you think I'm worried about physical bread? Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? And, they were probably thinking, okay, that's enough chastising. You don't need to ask any more questions. Jesus keeps going. Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember question after question after question after rhetorical question? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, okay, here's maybe a question you can answer. Let me toss you a softball here. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? Oh, we know that one. 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves, just more recently, when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? Oh, we're 2 for 2 now. 7, they replied. He said to them, do you still not understand? And Mark leaves the scene in his account before Matthew leaves the scene, because Matthew will go on to tell us that given enough time to think about it, Matthew says, then they realized, then they understood that Jesus had warned them about the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Matthew's account. Here, the teaching of the Pharisees and the Herodians. They ultimately do understand if Jesus needs bread, he'll get bread. If we've got 1 loaf, how many loaves do you want? How many do you need? That's not a problem for Jesus. What he's warning them of is spiritual danger, false teaching, whether it's coming from the Pharisees in their narrow legalistic view of things, the mountain of traditions that they had piled upon the people, or the danger of the teaching of the Sadducees who denied the existence of angels. who denied the existence of spirits, who denied the basic biblical doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, or whether it was the dangerous teaching of the Herodians, who thought that where real power was in political power, and maybe even melding that with the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees, that somehow God's purposes, God's kingdom could somehow be advanced through political machinations and political processes. Jesus says, you need to be careful. You need to be careful with all of that. And finally, they understood that. Verse 22 says that they came to Bethsaida. And we know from other texts, John chapter 1 in particular, that Bethsaida was the hometown of Peter and Andrew and Philip. 3 of the 12 apostles are from Bethsaida. Others might have been there from there as well. We just don't know, but at least 3 of the 12 apostles were from this town. And in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus had some scathing criticism for the residents of Bethsaida. People of Chorazin, people of Bethsaida, if the miracles I performed in your towns had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented a long time ago. And it's going to be more tolerable in the day of judgment for the people of Tyre and the people of Sidon, those ancient cities, than it will be for you, because of the miracles that were done there that didn't convince you. Miracles that you saw and just dismissed. So again, following Matthew's chronology, Jesus would have already pronounced that scathing condemnation and judgment against Bethsaida. So he has been there before, and the people have been largely unreceptive. But now he comes to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. And Jesus follows a process here, much like he did at the end of chapter 7 with the man who was deaf and had a great speech impediment. This isn't to be done as a show. This isn't a public performance. He respects the man's dignity. He respects the man's privacy. This is not the sideshow at the state fair or at the carnival. So verse 23 says that he took the blind man by the hand and led him. That's how the blind man had gotten there in the first place. He had to be led by people who cared about him, people who loved him. Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. And when he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, remember how Jesus spit and with his finger touched the man's tongue, and he put his fingers in his ears and said, Ephphatha. Jesus uses saliva once again, and he puts his hands on him. When the process is repeated a little later, we're specifically told that he touched the man's eyes. So Jesus then asked him, do you see anything? Now, typically, there's not a question that follows the miracles of Jesus. And that's what makes this miracle, which only Mark records. Matthew, Luke, John don't mention this one. This is the only miracle that is done in 2 stages, that is done in 2 phases, which raises some questions of why. But after this initial touching of the man, he asked him, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, and what he says indicates that this man had not been blind from birth. This was blindness that had come about because of an accident, because of an illness or disease, some injury perhaps that he had sustained, because he remembered in his mind, he remembered what trees looked like. And he said, and he knew what people were supposed to look like. He says, I see people, they look like trees walking around. So Jesus has taken the man out of town. Obviously, there were still a few other people around when Jesus performed this miracle. So once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored. He saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, don't even go into the village. Um, the, there's all kinds of speculation as to why this came in two phases, two stages. One thing we know can't be the case, that it was some failure on Jesus's part, that Jesus was swinging for the fence. He was going for a complete restoration of sight, but he just fell short. The power reserves were low, and that this was some failure. We know that can't be the case. Jesus has unlimited divine power available to him through the Spirit who came upon him, the Spirit who anointed him at his baptism. It probably has to do with the depth of this man's faith. So many people come to Jesus fully confident that he is the answer for their problem. The woman with the hemorrhage for 12 years, that even in her anemia and weakness pushes her way through the crowd just so that she can get her hand on the hem of Jesus's garment. The centurion who says to Jesus, hey, I understand authority, and I'm not even worthy for you to come to my house. So you just say the word, and I know that my servant will be healed. And Jesus said, I haven't encountered that kind of faith in all of Israel among this Gentile centurion. And maybe this blind man has been so discouraged by his circumstances, it may have been years that he had been suffering from this condition. And he's heard about Jesus. He wants to believe, but maybe there's still some cynicism and some skepticism in him, wondering if Jesus could really heal him. And so Jesus brings partial restoration of his sight to see what the man's response is going to be. Is he going to be disappointed? Is he going to say, is he going to feel, I knew better. I knew better than to have trusted you. Light is having an effect on me, but my sight's not clear. Just go away, leave me alone. I knew you couldn't heal me. That's not what happens here. Sort of like Jesus saying to the Syrophoenician woman, it's not right to take the children's bread and give it to dogs. That wasn't spoken to the woman to offend her and send her away in tears. It was intended to draw her in, and she seizes on that. And she says, yes, Lord, but even the household pets eat the crumbs that fall from the table. And so with this man, he doesn't say, oh, no, I see people, but they just look like trees walking around in disappointment. I think he says it in hope that things are moving in the right direction. I do, as we find another man saying, I do believe, help my unbelief. This man does believe, but it's in tension with doubt, and Jesus wants to draw him closer. So I think he says it with the tone and with the attitude. I see people. I haven't seen people in a long time. They're a little out of focus. They look like trees, but I see them. So once more, Jesus puts his hands on the man's eyes. His eyes were opened. His sight was restored. He saw everything clearly. And the man's faith is perfected. The man's faith is strengthened, and healing comes in its fullness. The man doesn't seem to live in Bethsaida. He says, don't bother going back into town. Just go home. And probably with the intent as well to keep things rather quiet. Remember, Jesus is controlling the narrative. Jesus wants to control the timing and the messaging. Jesus and his disciples then went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi, it was at a place that was also known as Banias or Panias, because it was an ancient site. It was an ancient site that was connected to the cultic worship of the Greek god Pan. And so it was called Panias or Banias. I just read an article last week about, even though so much was affected in 2020 in regard to all of life, it affected biblical archaeology as well. A lot of the digs that would typically be going on that had archaeologists and volunteers working in close proximity to people, a lot of that hadn't taken place last year. But there was an article that I saw in Christianity Today last week that described the 10 most significant archaeological discoveries in 2020, despite the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of those was the discovery of the ruins, the foundation of a 4th century church building that had been built on top of a more ancient shrine that was dedicated to the god Pan. And so it's shouldn't go without notice that Jesus goes to a place that is associated with the worship of idols and a false god to probe the depth of his disciples' faith about his identity, who he really was. So Jesus asked them, who do people say that I am? What's the buzz around the villages? What's the word on the street about who I am? And they replied in answer to his question. I mean, he wasn't asking them yet what they thought. He wants to contrast that with what's in the newspapers. What's the press saying about me? Well, some people think you're John the Baptist. Again, John the Baptist returned from the dead, like Herod Antipas had feared Jesus was John returned from the dead. Others say you're Elijah. Malachi had prophesied Elijah will come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. When we get into the transfiguration next week, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So some say you're John the Baptist, some say Elijah, still others, one of the prophets. Okay, enough about the populace. What about you? And the you is plural here in the Greek text. What about you guys? Who do you all say that I am? And Peter, and this is recorded this way in Mark and Matthew and Luke, the 3 Gospels that include this event. Peter answered, you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. The Hebrew word Mashiach, the Greek word Christos, which means the anointed one. Anointed ones in the Old Testament were kings and they were priests. They were consecrated, they were appointed to either their kingship or their priesthood through anointing with oil. And so the Mashiach was an anointed one, typically though a king. And Old Testament prophecy had identified this coming priest and king. And that's who the disciples believed. That's who Peter believed Jesus was. He wasn't John the Baptist. He wasn't Elijah. He was God's Messiah, God's anointed one. In Matthew, you are the Messiah. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. In Luke, Peter says you are God's Messiah. And Jesus warns them not to tell anyone about him. He's controlling the messaging. He's controlling the narrative. He's controlling the timetable. Verse 31, then once they have made that confession, he began to teach them that he, the Son of Man, must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. The title Son of Man is used by Jesus in reference to himself 81 times in the 4 Gospels. It has a history in the Old Testament. Son of Man typically just meant a man. A man's son is also a man. It's the phrase that God uses to address Ezekiel in his book of prophecy. God will say to him, Son of Man, do this. Son of Man, preach that. But in Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man is associated with the Ancient of Days. In Daniel's vision in Daniel chapter 7, he sees the Ancient of Days, God Almighty, sitting on his throne of reign, sitting on his seat of judgment, and one like a Son of Man coming up to him and receiving a kingdom. And his dominion would be forever. His kingdom would never end. And obviously, that is God's Messiah. And so the Son of Man, though, Jesus says, must do things, he must experience things and endure things and suffer things that conceptions about the Messiah that people had, that they had for centuries, it just couldn't be reconciled. The Messiah was going to be the restorative king, the powerful warrior who would drive the Romans into the Mediterranean Sea, who would reestablish a sovereign nation of Israel, who would restore David's throne. How can he be rejected by the religious leaders? Weren't the religious leaders the ones who were supposed to embrace the Messiah? Aren't they the ones who were supposed to know the most about him? So how could the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law reject him and then be killed and then raised on the third day? He was speaking plainly about this, Mark says in verse 32, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. The word that Mark uses here for rebuke is the same word that Mark has used earlier in his gospel in accounts of Jesus rebuking the evil spirits, rebuking the demons, spoken with great passion, spoken with a sense of authority. And somehow Peter thinks he's got this authority where he can rebuke Jesus, the one who he has just confessed to be the Messiah. And Jesus turns and looks at his disciples and he rebukes Peter. He has the authority to rebuke Peter. And he says, "Get behind me, Satan." He's not Satan incarnate, but you're on the wrong side, Peter, if that's your understanding. You're playing for the wrong team. You need to get firmly on my side and understand what my will is and what my Father's will is and what has to take place. Get behind me, Satan. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. You're going to have to trust me, Peter, that this is going to happen and that this has to happen. Then he calls the crowds to him along with the disciples, and he talks about this decision that has to be made. You either confess me or you deny me. You're either with me or you're against me. And the decision you make is going to determine your eternity. So he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Jesus has already said he's going to be killed. He hasn't yet specified how that death is going to come about. I'm sure that Peter would even be more unable to wrap his brain around the fact that Jesus was going to be crucified, that he would endure that kind of shame and torture and humiliation. But Jesus says, following me is taking up your cross. Taking up your cross meant you were sentenced to death. Your life was going to end. It was a one-way journey to the place of execution. People didn't come back from there. And Jesus says, you're going to have to sacrifice yourself. You're going to have to deny yourself if you're going to follow me. If you're going to try to save your life by denying me, so poignant and powerful here that he's talking about denying, partially in response to Peter, the one who is going to deny him. When put in that moment, when faced with that decision, do I confess him, do I own him, or do I deny him? Peter's going to deny him 3 times. If you're going to do that to try to save your physical life, you're going to end up losing your life. Maybe not your physical life in that moment. You're going to lose your spiritual life. you're going to lose your soul. But if you're willing to lose that for me and for the gospel, then you'll save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their own soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me in my words, if you're going to disassociate yourself from me in my words, if you're going to deny knowing me in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man's going to be ashamed of you and disown you when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. What we decide now is going to determine the outcome then. And that's a decision we make when we surrender our lives to God through Jesus Christ. We confess him as the Lord's Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. But that's a confession that has to continue to be lived. Peter's going to say the right words just before this. You're the Christ. You're the Messiah. Several pages over in Mark, I don't know him. I never knew him. And he's going to curse and he's going to swear and say, I don't know him. Thankfully, that's not where Peter ends up, but it's how far Peter falls, from which the Lord has to lift him up. So Jesus here talks about the cost of discipleship. It's self-denial. It's putting the concerns of God and the concerns of the kingdom of God above our own. We're going to close there for today. We'll pick up with chapter 9 and Mark's account of the transfiguration. Thanks for being with us today. And I hope you have a blessed day of worship today, whether, again, that's in person or online, not just from our church family here in Broken Arrow, but for those of you who are worshiping with us online from various places around the country. Be blessed, stay safe, stay warm, and we'll see you next week.